Hi everyone, Daryl Dixon here with Rhyme Signatures, the nerdiest music review this side of having the longest hair of any human being in a zombie apocalypse, yet still never having it grabbed by a member of the shambling horde and getting dragged to your inevitable, grisly death. And today we are going to be doing a review of the classic Ayreon album, The Human Equation. Welcome once again, one and all, to my classic series, where I get out some of my thoughts on albums that have shaped me not only musically, but from a very personal level. These classic albums I'll be looking at over the coming months are going to be ones that are so much more than just a sequence of songs for me. The point of these videos isn't really to review the album in a traditional sense, but more to analyse just how this album has made me feel, what it means to me, and how it helped to shape what I consider to be my musical identity. So one of the hardest parts about getting into something for the first time is, where on earth are you supposed to start? Some things have it easy. You want to get into football, you're probably going to start by supporting the local team. You want to get into archery, you'll pootle on down to the nearest range and twang a few strings. Fancy a hand at playing a musical instrument? There's likely to be a tutor nearby if you live in a reasonably sized town. Figuring out where to start with a music genre, though, can be a little bit tricky, as what you like from music can vary from person to person. One man's trash, another's treasure, etc, etc. So, short of wading through a near endless amount of old and new bands looking for the one whose sound gels with you, what else are you supposed to do? Well, I can share my own advice with you at this point, and that advice is pretty simple, really. If you're looking to get into prog metal, listen to this album. The Human Equation is often considered Arjen Lucassen's masterpiece across all of his various projects. Some would cite Into the Electric Castle, and I do feel there is definitely some merit to this opinion, but I cut my teeth on The Human Equation, and as such it will forever and always be one of the albums I treasure the most, because it is responsible for just so much. I can vividly remember back in the halcyon days of my university life when I had first started taking music more seriously. I'd been on the most aggressive obsession of all things Dream Theater. I kind of read every single nugget of trivia, absorbed all the bootleg live recordings I could get, and most importantly, I followed the band members to whatever side projects or guest appearances they would get involved with. This somewhat inevitably led me to Ayreon, Arjen Lucassen's premier team-up project. Forget your Marvel Cinematic Universe crossovers, kids. Arjen was doing this kind of superstar lineup thing years before it. I forget how I found out about it, but I heard that James LaBrie was going to be a prominent guest on this album, and so of course I had to get my fix. And yes, sure, James was and is great on this album, but it was all of the other associated vocalists and musicians who really made this stand out for me. I was introduced to Opeth through this album, and through Opeth I found a love of death metal, and through death metal I found black metal, post-metal, deathcore, metalcore, doom metal, and all the other darker tinged denizens of the metal spectrum. I found Devin Townsend through this album, and that alone set me down a completely crazy rollercoaster ride of musical discoveries. The late, great Mike Baker of Shadow Gallery was another highlight, and I found some of my favourite albums of all time through them in the form of Room 5 and Tyranny. Then, of course, there was Arjen's work himself. I still had a bunch more Ayreon albums that came out prior to this that I could also now enjoy, and each subsequent Ayreon record that I listened to opened up more and more doors for me, and my exposure to the mad wonderland that is progressive metal blossomed into something gigantic, sweeping and beautiful. But ultimately, it was The Human Equation that started the ball rolling for me. As I said earlier, this series is about records that shaped me, moulded me, and this album absolutely fits that bill. Luckily, this record is more than just a star-studded guest list. It's a captivating album with a brilliant narrative coursing through its veins and some of the most creative, diverse and interesting instrumentation in Arjen's extensive career. I found myself imprinting on concept albums a lot when I was in my late teens to early 20s, and The Human Equation remains one of my all-time favourite examples of this. The story is reasonably simple on paper, but like so many good stories, it's about the journey, rather than how well you can summarise it in a quick blurb. but a quick blurb I shall nonetheless provide and wait for the internet to tell me I've got it all wrong. The story follows our protagonist, as sung by James Labrie, who is involved in a car accident and winds up in a hospital bed in a coma. He's visited by his wife and his best friend while hooked up to life support machines, who have been having an affair prior to the accident. Scandal. During the course of the album, Labrie's character is visited and challenged by his emotions, his passions, his memories and feelings, whilst he tries to reconcile his life and finally wake up. Watched over by his wife and best friend, they provide context to his physical state outside of the mental trials and tribulations he is undergoing, as they confess their affair to him and assure him that they never meant to cause harm through their selfish actions. It's honestly a brilliantly well-told story. The lyrics are straightforward without ever feeling simplistic, but they manage to make the tale an easy one to follow. But it's not without unexpected twists, turns and payoffs throughout. I was listening to this one around about the same time that I was also obsessed with Dream Theater scenes from my memories, so I've kind of got this sort of strange memory association of the two of them, even though the stories aren't even kind of remotely the same. But it really did make me appreciate James Labrie even more, as he was in not one, but two of my favourite concept albums ever at this point. Story and vocals aside, what really sets this one out for me amongst Arjen's work is just how varied it is musically. You've got the classic progressive metal stylings of tracks like Isolation, Voices, Realization and Disclosure, but then you've got gentle, more intimate tracks, some of them almost defying classification, like Hope, Playground and Sign. If you combine that with the dark, heavy, brooding and sinister songs like Loser, Trauma and Betrayal, you've got a veritable smorgasbord of moods and emotions to cater for practically every listener. But it's not even just the variety here, as a lot of albums do oftentimes feel like they've thrown in variety for the sake of it, so they can say, oh look how quirky and inventive we are as we hop, skip and jump through 17 different genres over the course of 3 minutes. The Human Equation thankfully suffers from none of that. Pacing and placement of each stylistic shift on this record is phenomenal. Nothing ever feels overbearing or outstays its welcome. When it wants you to feel as overwhelmed as the central character, it knows precisely how to do this in such a way that you can recover from it almost immediately. The ebb and flow of the Human Equation is near perfect, never sitting still on one particular mood for long, but always managing to get the balance just right. For me, there's not a single moment on this album I would ever call boring. There is always something else coming, always a new and exciting musical passage or vocal delivery or whatever to keep you on your toes. It's a constantly evolving, ever-shifting, beautiful reflection of a man's heart and soul as he fights to regain consciousness. I've mentioned earlier that a lot of people do consider Into the Electric Castle to be the better Ayreon album. I think maybe in hindsight I can certainly appreciate it from perhaps a technical or compositional perspective. It probably is the better of the two albums. But the Human Equation has something that Into the Electric Castle lacks, and that's the simple act of being a much more grounded story that's far easier to relate to. Electric Castle, for all of its people snatched from time to do the bidding of a cosmic entity, is fascinating, don't get me wrong, and possibly the most prog concept ever. But it's the relative simplicity of the Human Equation that kept me coming back to it over and over. It's an easy album to relate to feel empathetic towards its characters, to relate to the scenarios and memories of our protagonist. There's a realness to Arjen's lyrics here that some people might pass off as trite or cheesy, but I personally feel that there's a homely, comforting quality to the lyrics. No one's trying to sound grand or fantastical. The characters talk like regular people, addressing their fears in a human fashion and ultimately benefiting from being relatable as a consequence of this. By the time the album closes out, I do feel a genuine empathy for all of the characters in this little story. And again, it's that small scale of this that really helps you to connect with the album. Ayreon records are generally rather bombastic and grandiose in the scope of their plots, from an advanced civilization sending back images to medieval times to warn their past selves of their impending doom, to the last man alive exploring the whole scope of human history through a really fancy VR machine, to an all-powerful cosmic deity plucking people from out of their timelines to play a game for his amusement. The simplistic nature of the Human Equation story 100% works in its favour, with the relatively low stakes making for a much less stressful listen than some of Arjen's other works. So, What else can I say about The Human Equation? This will forever and always be an album I'm immensely thankful for. It showed me the way to so many of my favourite bands, unlocking the mysteries of the progressive music enigma to me in ways that others just hadn't managed at the point that I discovered this. Now, I've been a fan of Arjen's ever since this album, and while I haven't always been on board with everything he's done, I have never doubted his resolve, creativity and love for everything he creates. If you've ever been on the fence about progressive rock or metal, I really cannot think of a better jumping off point than this record. It's deep, layered, nuanced and intelligent, but it's also really accessible, approachable and very listener friendly. There's really a little bit of everything on this record, and as such, even if there are parts that might not stick with you, the chances are you will find a sound you enjoy, a vocalist who imprints on you maybe, and before you know it, you found a springboard to a whole new, exciting and endlessly thrilling world of music and adventure. The Human Equation is one of the most important records I have ever listened to, and I hope that if you haven't heard it yet, that it rocks your socks off as much as it did mine, way back when in my late teens to early 20s. This, guys, is all of course just my opinion, as you should well know. If you have listened to this record, let me know what you thought about it in the comments down there. 2023 is coming up. We've got a lot of exciting records coming out in the first 3 months. I'm really looking forward to getting my thoughts out on those and letting you all know what's coming up next. If you did like this video, please do share it with anyone who you think would enjoy it. Please do consider subscribing for some more content. And if you really like me, please click my Ko-fi link down below to help support the channel. Until next time, guys, keep your rhyme signatures odd.